Since I'm supposed to address you for an enormous period of an hour, including your questions, my approach will be a simple one. Many of you, as I went around asking you what you would like to hear, said, talk about your experiences. So I will try to personalize it. What did it look like? What were we trying to do? How were the trials organized? How were the work divided? What were the main principles which came out of it? How does it affect some of the major problems of today, such as the war in Iraq? What about the position taken by the United States government at this time in opposition to the ICC, the International Criminal Court? So if I deal with all that, and then what can you do about it? I like to see the young students here, because whatever we can do about it is going to take more time than either of these two old codgers have got left. So it's going to take a while. But let me begin then by projecting, skimming along back to World War II. My son, Don, is indicating that I should pay attention to something.
I don't like normally to interrupt the speaker, but if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask one question right at the beginning, since you're touching on going back to World War II. And here's the question. I know that when you began your opening statement as the prosecution statement for the Einsatzgruppen trial, you began by saying, "May it please your honors, it is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the deliberate slaughter of more than 1 million innocent and defenseless men, women, and children. This was the tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance." I happen to have this on a video. You and I had discussed this a little bit earlier. Would you mind if I show this for just a moment now?
Be my guest. The person you will see, you will recognize immediately as the same one you see here with no change.
We are now ready to hear the presentation by the prosecution.
This was the tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance. Vengeance is not our goal, nor do we seek merely a just retribution. We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity, regardless of his race or creed. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. We shall establish, beyond the realm of doubt, facts which, before the dark decade of the Third Reich, would have seemed incredible. Courts will show that the slaughter committed by these defendants was dictated not by military necessity, but by that supreme perversion of thought, the Nazi theory of the master race. We shall show that these deeds of men in uniform were the methodical execution of long-range plans to destroy ethnic, national, political, and religious groups which stood condemned in the Nazi mind. Genocide, the extermination of whole categories of human beings, was a foremost instrument of the Nazi doctrine of man. Mr. Glancy will now read part one of the opening statement.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate my son, Don, drawing to my attention the fact that he planned this projection. And also that the opening sentence was missing. I began with the declaration, "It is with sorrow and with hope that we here present this trial." And I called for a rule of law which would protect all of humankind against the type of crimes which I was about to disclose. Those views which were expressed about 60 years ago, I still maintain today. And so let me skip again back to show you how they evolved where those ideas came from, and where did they go to, and what does it mean to you, who can carry on, I hope, the sentiments and goals expressed in that opening paragraph of the opening statement. I entered the Army after trying unsuccessfully to enter the Air Force and some other branches of service. And I was a graduate of the Harvard Law School, so they immediately made me a private in the artillery. But I was assigned as a typist in a supply room, and I also couldn't type. I had come to America as an immigrant child with immigrant parents who had no money, no skills, no language. They were fleeing persecution from what was Hungary and Romania. We lived in poverty in Hell's Kitchen in New York, which was the most dense crime area in the United States at that time. At a very early age, I decided that I would rather be on the other side of the law. And I went to school in New York, City College, which was known then as the poor man's Harvard. I got a scholarship in Harvard Law School on my exam on criminal law. I knew more criminals than I knew lawyers. And off I went into the Army, being trained for the invasion of France. Well, you know the war stories. I don't have to go into that. Somebody tipped off the Germans. When I landed at the beaches of Normandy, they were running in the opposite direction. The fact that General Patton came along to keep me company may have had something to do with it. But when we landed in France, finally, after going through all of the battles, the President and other world leaders had declared the Germans would be held accountable for their crimes, which were pretty well known. We didn't know the details, but I had been working as a research assistant to one of the professors at Harvard who was doing a book on war crimes. And I had read everything in the Harvard Law Library on war crimes, and I was getting the reports coming in from the underground in Europe about what was happening, and he was getting them. So we had a fairly good idea, and the Germans had been warned because we were concerned with ex post facto, and they were told early that they would be held to account. The first trials which we encountered, and I mention this because they have been all but forgotten, perhaps for good reason, are the military commission trials. My first assignments, which was, and I hammered up the signs on some of these things, war crimes section, I was probably the first man in the United States Army working on war crimes. The officers who were assigned to do it in the judge advocate section, they were familiar with conduct unbecoming a gentleman. They were not familiar with the mass murder and genocide. But the first reports we came in were that Allied flyers had been shot down and were beaten to death by the people on the ground. Orders had come out of Berlin, treat the Allied flyers as war criminals. They are bombing innocent children, civilians, etc., and treat them accordingly. And that's what they did. Some Germans rescued some of the flyers if they landed in a farmhouse somewhere, and that should be mentioned, but there weren't many. Most of them did what they were instructed to do. And so the way we dealt with that is a report would come into 3rd Army headquarters, that's General Patton's headquarters, Judge Advocate Division, handed down to the colonel in charge, pass it on to Corporal Ferencz. What are we going to do? I got in a jeep. I'd ride out to the area where the crime was reported to have occurred, find the burgomaster or the chief of police or the highest official who was still there. Most of them had tried to flee. Tell them, bring in everybody who was within 100 yards of that event and bring them down here to headquarters in some room somewhere which was not bombed out. Line them up against the wall. And at that time I didn't speak German very well. And I'd get somebody who said they spoke both languages, said, you're the translator, now you tell them that they're going to write out exactly